All right, we're going to get started. So thank you everyone who is joining us. We have a couple of announcements as everyone joins. First, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the conference ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during this session, please go ahead and use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentation and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. And it looks like we are ready to get started. So Ilana, I'm going to hand it over to you to get us started.
All right, thanks everyone for joining this special session. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm sure we're going to have some great presentations. We're going to start with Doug Shinneman, and he's going to talk about fire and invasive dynamics in North American deserts. And I'll turn it over to you, Doug.
Okay, everybody see my screen?
We can, looks great.
All right, well, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to talk about fire and invasive plant species dynamics in North American deserts. So the North American desert level 1 ecoregion covers roughly 2 million square kilometers and is made up of both cold and warm desert ecosystems. Mean annual temperatures and aridity generally increase across a north to south gradient, with the warm deserts being the hottest and most arid. Another important gradient is the seasonality of precipitation across North American deserts. Summer precipitation generally increases across a west to east gradient, at least within the US portion of the deserts, and much of the western half of the cold desert ecoregion sees mostly winter or spring precipitation, while much of the warm deserts receive mostly summer precipitation via the North American monsoon. Other portions of the cold and warm deserts are more transitional, receiving varying amounts of winter and summer precipitation. So delineating further to level 3 ecoregions, these climate gradients affect soil and moisture temperature regimes, which in turn influence native vegetation structure and composition, which we can see here among the different desert level 3 ecoregions, but also invasive species distributions. Of particular importance, evapotranspiration potential influences the amount of water stored in deep soil layers, which in turn influences the relative abundance of woody and herbaceous species, plant species among the ecoregions. Areas that receive more winter to early spring precip typically have deeper soil water storage and a higher proportion of shrubs, while areas that receive predominantly summer precip have little deep water storage and a higher proportion of perennial grasses. However, within each ecoregion, plant communities can vary widely based on factors such as elevation or soil salinity or land use. But note too that the temperate Sierras and the southwestern semi-arid highlands are largely surrounded by these desert ecoregions. I won't have time to address these ecoregions in this presentation, but they will be addressed in the forthcoming invasive species fire publication that Matt Brooks is leading. So the various temperature and precipitation regimes also influence the occurrence of large fires. Figure A at left shows how less arid and more productive desert regions generally have more frequent and larger fires due to greater fuel loads and fuel continuity, and combined with dry summer weather. In contrast, ecoregions with summer precip regimes typically have shorter fire seasons with smaller fires, and most of which burn earlier in the year, often caused by dry lightning storms during the early monsoon. There are some exceptions to that. Portions of the Mojave Desert, where there's more winter precipitation, for instance, can contribute to more fine fuels and can create bigger fires. But those are sort of the general patterns. The figure at right, figure B, shows how conversion to invasive annual grasses is also related to aridity and precipitation seasonality, with resistance to invasive annual grasses generally lowest in areas with wet winters, but resistance increases with aridity due to less favorable conditions for establishment or increasing strong competition from native perennial grass species, which are favored by summer rainfall. These factors influence the probability of invasive grass fire cycles to develop, which we'll discuss a little later. So here's a more recent depiction of wildfire in the Western US, focused on the sagebrush biome, in which we can see a heavy concentration of large fires in the winter precipitation dominated portion of the cold desert. Fires greater than 40,000 hectares are not uncommon in the northern portions of the biome, the Northern Great Basin in particular. And some fire complexes in single years have approached 400,000 hectares, or roughly 1 million acres. Since 1984, wildfires have burned at least 9 million hectares in this region, about 22 million acres of historical sagebrush habitat, and most of that was in the Great Basin, again in the cool desert portions. Evidence for increasing fire sizes and fire frequency for portions of the sagebrush biome have been documented in a number of studies, and research has shown that the largest fires occurring in the Great Basin over recent decades have been associated with a disproportionate abundance of non-native annual grass species. Indeed, invasion by exotic grasses and forbs can alter composition, function, and structure of native plant communities, affecting fuels. Exotic herbaceous species often increase fine fuel loads and fuel continuity in these otherwise often fuel-limited systems, even at relatively low abundance. Among the most problematic invasive grasses are the winter annuals, especially the brome grasses that are well suited to areas dominated by winter precipitation, are effective competitors. Invasibility by species is closely related to soil climatic regimes, with species such as cheatgrass and red brome causing invasive grass fire cycles primarily in the cold desert and warm desert regions, respectively. Other invasive annual grasses, such as Medusa head and North Africa grass, are found throughout the cold deserts and appear to be expanding. And they're also potentially problematic in terms of their contribution to fire. There are also perennial invasive grasses that are increasing fire activity, particularly in the warm deserts, such as buffalo grass and Lehman lovegrass, which are fire-adapted species that can grow in dense patches and that increase fuel loadings and fire intensity. And these species are sometimes quite extensive. A recent study, for instance, documented that cheatgrass attains greater than 15% cover over roughly 210,000 square kilometers, or about 31% of the Intermountain West. And those areas were 2 times more likely to burn and 4 times more likely to burn multiple times than areas with less cheatgrass cover. So when invasive plants alter fire regimes to promote their own persistence and dominance over native communities, an invasive plant fire cycle can establish. And we can see this at work in the cold deserts, especially where winter precipitation dominates. Historically, landscapes dominated by sagebrush ecosystems often had relatively discontinuous fuel loadings with sparse cover of herbaceous species between shrub canopies, and they often burned really infrequently, on the order of hundreds of years or more in many of the more fuel-limited Wyoming big sagebrush communities, for example. And these communities often required several decades or more to recover to mature shrub conditions. But as fire-prone exotic annuals, such as cheatgrass, have invaded much of the sagebrush biome, they filled shrub interspaces and have provided continuous fine fuel loadings. Those fuel loadings dry early in the growing season and can facilitate large fires. After fire, the fire-adapted non-native species rapidly establish and outcompete slower recovering native species. And the highly flammable annual grasslands are then capable of promoting short fire return intervals in many landscapes. Preventing native species reestablishment, especially non-sprouting shrubs, without extensive restoration efforts. And many of those efforts are relatively unsuccessful. This ultimately results in permanent ecosystem type conversion to an alternative state that is easily ignitable, prolongs the fire season, and promotes further spread of invasive annual grass dominance. Similar dynamics can occur in portions of the warm deserts. In the Mojave and Sonoran deserts, for example, susceptibility to grass fire cycles is greater, where climatic regimes supported native vegetation that lacked the continuity or flammability to promote periodic historical fires, and thus never really evolved fire tolerant traits. The other condition under which This can occur where seasonal precipitation is sufficient to allow invasive annual grasses to establish and eventually dominate. In contrast, the desert grasslands found across portions of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts can include fire-tolerant plant functional groups and thus have relatively high resilience after fire and are generally less susceptible to the invasive grass fire cycle. So to summarize with a couple of graphics, the potential for invasive grass fire cycles to develop is greatest in areas with low to moderate resilience to fire and low resistance to invasive annual grasses. Resilience to fire increases along soil temperature and precipitation gradients that essentially correspond to ecosystem productivity. So for example, many Wyoming big sagebrush communities were historically fuel limited, but they're also susceptible to invasion by winter annuals that increase fine fuels. And these native communities have relatively low resistance to invasion and low resilience, in large part because native species are generally slow to recover after fire. In contrast, lost my place. In contrast, mountain big sagebrush community types are generally more productive ecosystems with higher fuel availability, and they support more frequent fire historically, from which they are more resilient, in large part because native species generally are capable of rapid post-fire recovery. So both warm and cold deserts support a tremendous amount of biological diversity. For example, sagebrush ecosystems provide habitat for over 350 plant and animal species of conservation concern, including species such as the greater sage grouse, which is a key sagebrush obligate, considered at risk throughout its range. And if recent fire trends continue, a USGS study predicted an overall 43% decline in the sage grouse population in the Great Basin from its current size by the year 2045, based on modeled effects of wildfire and sage grouse habitat and populations over the previous 30 years. The thick lines in this, in this graph represent median effects on sage grouse populations over time within high, moderate, and low resistance and resilience classes. And unfortunately, the low R&R classes make up most of the Great Basin, as you can see from the map at right, and are therefore the most susceptible to fire-induced type conversions to annual grasslands, which are largely inadequate for sagebrush obligate species. So although we won't have time to address management options in great detail, traditional approaches include, which have been covered in previous presentations, include traditional approaches such as mechanical or chemical treatments for fuels reduction or weed control, strategies to reduce fire starts and fire spread, and engaging in post-fire restoration treatments. And these management actions can be aided by data collection and scientific research that provide a better understanding of basic ecological relationships, such as the effects of climate, disturbance, and land use and treatments on both the realized and fundamental niches of invasive species. Monitoring change in the field, especially in at-risk landscapes, is also important, as is using remote sensing technology and image analysis for early detection and mapping of invasive species, in which we rely on detection of the distinct cover, morphology, or phenology among invaded versus native landscapes to detect invasive species, and especially ideally to detect early invasions and have a chance to stop them while they're in those early stages. Federal agencies are also increasingly taking regional approaches to reduce large catastrophic wildfires in these landscapes. An example is the recent decision by the Department of Interior to construct and maintain roughly 11,000 miles of strategically placed linear fuel breaks in coming years, within the coming several years to decades, to control wildfires within a 223 million acre region centered on the Great Basin. This is a really ambitious plan, one that'll add to the thousands of miles of existing fuel breaks. However, relatively little is known about the ecological effects or the relative effectiveness of fuel breaks in arid and semi-arid shrublands. So USGS scientists and our partners are actively investigating potential ecological effects of fuel breaks, including impacts on invasive species and native wildlife, as well as using fire behavior and other modeling programs to inform the design of fuel break networks to optimize their benefits. And I won't have time to go into this slide in great detail, but I want to point out how management strategies may differ depending on whether fire-promoting invasives are already widespread within a region, in which case it may be best to focus management on fuels and fire, versus when they are in the process of invading new areas, in which case traditional invasive plant management strategies may be a better priority. And these strategies can include unique approaches that take place before, during, or after fire, or before, during, and after invasion. And as a word of caution, as the picture at right demonstrates, we have to be careful about treatments, as control of one undesirable species can lead to the increased abundance of another. The future of invasive species-fire relationships will also be highly dependent on impacts of future climate change. Predicting these impacts remains challenging, as the expected changes in climate and effects on ecosystems will be highly variable over time and space. Moreover, there's generally less agreement among individual climate models for future precipitation change than there is for temperature change. Among individual models, precipitation varies from slightly drier for much of the region to substantially wetter, and even more model variation occurs concerning seasonality of precipitation. Understanding these areas of agreement on uncertainty are important because they'll help to inform the future climate niche distribution of native species like sagebrush, but also the distribution and productivity of invasive species, as well as fire weather patterns and projected future fire activity. And just to underscore the challenges and the uncertainty about predicting future climate effects on vegetation and fire, consider this projection shown here for the year 2070 that suggests about 18% of the Great Basin ecoregion will see an increase in cheatgrass cover, much of which will be in the already cheatgrass plagued Snake River Plain, which is that bright reddish orangish area on the map at upper left, and the projected increases on the map at right. Does this mean that more fire will occur in the region in the future? Probably, but not necessarily. For instance, Bradley and others showed that although fire generally increases with cheatgrass cover, it doesn't increase significantly after a certain cover percent threshold. Moreover, although the length of fire season and extreme fire weather conditions have been projected to increase as climate warms, these same drier and warmer conditions or shifts in seasonality and precipitation could reduce the influence of fine fuels. So complex long-term future interactions between climate, fire, and vegetation, including potential negative feedback loops, remain difficult to predict with great certainty. But it's certainly possible that some areas could experience less fire over time if fuels become increasingly limited. So in conclusion, these complex relationships between invasive plants and fire depends on multiple factors such as climate regimes, ecophysiological characteristics of the species, existing plant functional types and their relative fire adapted capacity, and past land use effects as well, which we really haven't talked about much in this presentation. But climate change will add a new level of complexity, given uncertain range shifts, enhanced fire weather conditions, and interactions that will likely lead to novel conditions. And addressing these coming changes effectively may require a greater emphasis on anticipatory scientific research, coupled with adaptive management strategies. And with that, I'll close and take any questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Doug. I don't see any questions in the chat, but we have about 2 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, please start typing. And Doug, if you have anything else you'd like to add, feel free.
Okay, something to fill the time.
With all the variability in the future precipitation, have there been any predictions if there's one invasive that might be more likely than another to become more dominant or widespread?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, it really depends on how these precipitation patterns play out. Certainly possible that with more early season or winter precipitation that species like cheatgrass could benefit, at least in the near term, or possibly move upwards in elevation and affect systems that up to this point haven't been as heavily impacted by winter annuals like cheatgrass. So it really depends a lot on not just the amount of precipitation, but when that precipitation arrives, and how that might affect not just the ecosystems that are already affected, but those adjacent ecosystems that could be sort of collateral damage as these species start to shift their ranges.
Doug, there's another question from Huva here, and they asked, what effect does mastication have on invasive species?
Mastication. Well, yeah, another good question. There's a number of studies on the effects of mastication. I don't have the sort of good summary at the ready for that one. So I'm going to maybe refer that question, or I'll think about it, maybe answer that question a little bit later. But certainly mastication in pinyon juniper woodlands and so on can have varying influences on non-native species, and I just don't have a quick answer for you, I'm afraid.
All right, thanks, Doug.
Yeah, thanks.
So next up, we have Amy Symstad, who will be talking about challenges and challenges and opportunities in the management of fire and invasive plants in the North American Great Plains. And so, Amy, you could start sharing your slides.
All right, can you see my screen?
We sure can, looks great.
All right, well, thank you for joining me today. And I also want to, of course, thank my co-authors, Jackie Ott from the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Rapid City, and Jesse Nippert with Kansas State University. I didn't see many presentations about Great Plains grasslands in the conference agenda. So before I talk about fire and invasives in the region, I'll make sure you have a decent understanding of the ecosystem. Then I'll talk about the two most widespread and abundant invasive plant types in this system, woody species and grasses. I'll briefly touch on invasive forbs, and then I'll wrap up with the main messages that I want you to remember. So North America's Great Plains were the second largest grassland ecoregion in the world. And as you might expect with such a large area, the region hosts a variety of grassland types, and they're broadly categorized in this figure, which are type 2 ecoregions, as temperate, semi-arid, and coastal. This variety comes from not only soils, but also, as in the previous talk, from two climatic gradients. Mean annual temperature warms from 0 on the northern edge to 20 degrees C on the southern edge, and annual precipitation increases from 200 millimeters in the northwest to 1,200 millimeters in the southeast. Diurnal and annual temperature variation and intra and interannual variation in precipitation also grade across the region. And basically summing up those gradients, it ends up that the plants of the northwestern Great Plains experience more weather variability than in the south and east. Most Great Plains grasslands are dominated by C4 or warm season grasses, but those in the northwest third or so are dominated by C3 or cool season grasses. Although the pre-European vegetation of the region was primarily grassland, the southern portions have always graded somewhat into savanna and the western portions into sage shrubland. And those woody areas are indicated by the darker tan coloration in this map from the National Land Cover Database. Only a small portion of the native vegetation remains in this region, and most of that loss is due to conversion to cropland, which appears as a salmon color in this map. And if you can distinguish your colors, you can see that almost all of the eastern tallgrass region has been converted to agriculture, mostly corn and soybeans. And the largest chunks of grasslands remaining are in western South Dakota, the Nebraska Sandhills, and eastern Colorado. However, grasslands continue to be converted to row crop agriculture almost everywhere in the region. Three forces interacted to develop the grasslands of the Great Plains. I mentioned the climate gradients and variability already. and those were the first of these three forces. The second was the herds of bison and other ungulates that roam the region, and their pre-settlement abundance means that the native vegetation is grazing tolerant or even grazing dependent. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold here. And then the third of these forces was frequent fire ignited both by indigenous peoples and by lightning. All three of these drivers have been drastically altered since European settlement, but today we're focusing on fire, of course, and that has been greatly reduced or even eliminated due to landscape fragmentation and active fire suppression. And more specifically, the pyrochemistry calculations of Richard Guyette and his colleagues, which he calibrated with fire-scarred trees where you can find them in this largely treeless landscape, suggests that the potential fire return intervals were on the order of 3 to 4 years in the southern part of the region and 16 to 17 years in the northern part. But that was, of course, before we squashed fires and fragmented the grasslands. Recent compilation of wildfire information for the Great Plains by Donovan and colleagues showed that the area burned by large wildfires has actually quadrupled since the 1980s. But if you use this figure from their paper and do a little very simple math, the data that they compiled also suggests that the area burned in even the largest wildfire years in each of the subregions is at most 1% of the area of that subregion. Now, I calculated these values that are in red here simply by dividing the highest burned hectare value by the subregion's area. And you have to keep in mind that land conversion to row crops, which are basically unburnable vegetation, means that this is a really rough way to approximate fire return intervals currently. But I think it's pretty clear that the numbers do show that the fire return intervals are still quite long compared to the pre-settlement regimes that Guyette calculated. So that's my really quick overview of the context of the Great Plains. I'll now move on to the invasive species. So if you ignore the corn, soy, and other row crops, the most visually striking invasive species in many Great Plains grasslands are trees and shrubs. And this is because these species affect not only vegetation composition, but they also profoundly change the structure and functioning of Great Plains grasslands. The encroachers vary in their origin in that they're both native and exotic to North America. They vary in their growth form, including both trees and shrubs and evergreen and deciduous species. And they vary in their response to fire in that some are usually killed by fire, whereas others resprout after being burned. The most widespread and notorious of these encroaching species are the native coniferous species. Although they're present in most grasslands in the region, as you can see in the figure on the left, they're most abundant in the east, central, and southern Great Plains, where some rangelands are now basically juniper woodlands instead of grasslands. Altogether, encroachment of woody species into Great Plains grasslands causes a range of problems, from reducing biodiversity and forage production to altering hydrology, nutrient cycling, and fire regimes. So why are these species encroaching into these grasslands? Well, first, people like trees, so they have planted them around their homes and around their fields to protect their crops and livestock from wind. Second, in some places, heavy grazing weakened the grasses enough that the woody species could get a foothold in places where grasses would usually keep them out. Third, there's some evidence that increasing carbon dioxide favors these species, which are C3, compared to the most of the dominant grasses, which are C4. And then finally, of course, we took away fire from this system. And even in areas with prescribed fire programs that are specifically trying to prevent or reduce woody encroachment, the fire return intervals are usually much longer than what the grassland system evolved with. And this is a problem because recent studies have shown that restoring the historical fire regimes in Great Plains grasslands invaded even by native woody species is often not enough to eliminate the encroachment. Instead, more frequent and or more intense fires than the historical regime are needed to reverse the course of encroachment. This reversal seems to be possible in juniper encroached grasslands because they're usually killed by fire. But in areas where deciduous shrubs are the main invaders, such as in tallgrass regions, the shrubs can cause a positive feedback loop in which areas with dense enough shrub encroachment become unburnable. And this has happened at the Konza Prairie Long-Term Ecological Research Site in the Flint Hills of Kansas, where blocks of land encroached by dogwood and other shrubs, deciduous shrubs, because of fire exclusion, have not returned to grassland even 16 years after they've initiated an annual fire regime. Now the shrubs have decreased, but they're still quite a bit more abundant than they are in areas that have always had an annual fire regime, or at least a more frequent fire regime. So I'll move on to grasses, which are the other type of widespread and abundant invasive plant in the Great Plains. Unlike the woody encroachers, these are all basically exotic to North America, but like many woody encroachers, many have been extensively planted, often as pasture grasses. And though these tame species, as they're often referred to by rangeland specialists, although these species often provide good forage for domestic livestock, they're also quite good at invading native grasslands, where they reduce native diversity and habitat for native animal species. Of the 10 species that get the most attention in the scientific literature, 8 are cool season, and I indicate cool as blue in the list on the slide here, and red are the warm season. Cheatgrass and field brome Bromus tectorum and Bromus arvensis, also known as Bromus japonicus, are the only extensively problematic annual grasses in this region. The rest are perennials. Now, these maps from the NRCS's rangeland inventory show that the northeastern Great Plains grasslands are heavily invaded by 2 cool season perennials, the bluegrasses and the rhizomatous bluegrasses such as Kentucky bluegrass and Canada bluegrass, as well as smooth brome. Whereas the annual bromes are more of a problem in the central part of the Great Plains. The warm season grasses are problematic in the southern half of the Great Plains, but not enough to be reported on by the NRCS in their summary of invasive grasses across the private rangelands in this part of the country. Now, fire can be a tool for managing all of these invasive grasses, but I'm going to go through some of that very briefly. I'll begin my discussion about them with the annual bromes because their fire story is different in this region than in the more arid West, as you just heard about in our previous talk, and you may have probably have heard various other times. First and foremost, I want to emphasize that there's no evidence to suggest that annual bromes promote wildfire in this system. That might simply be due to lack of attention to fire regimes so far. There's some thought that their early brown down compared to the perennial grasses in this system may promote wildfire spread earlier in the growing season than would occur in uninvaded areas. Also, so far, there's no evidence that wildfire promotes annual bromes in the Great Plains. The only study I could find to quantify this comes from the sagebrush grassland ecotone on the western edge of the Great Plains. And the top graph from this study shows that areas burned by wildfire actually had lower cover of annual bromes than unburned areas. However, at smaller scales in this same system, annual bromes are quick to colonize the space that's created when sagebrush plants are killed by fire, and sage mortality is quite likely when the annual brome cover is above about 15% of plant cover. A study in grasslands just a bit east of those in the previous slide showed another type of threshold in fire and annual brome management in the Great Plains. In northern mixed grass prairies of western Nebraska and South Dakota, a fall prescribed fire reduced annual brome cover for 2 years when annual bromes comprised about 60% or less of total plant cover. These reductions in annual bromes with fire are likely caused by mortality of 2 cohorts of the annual grasses, not only the emerged seedlings, but also the seeds in the litter layer. And early work by Steve Wisenant suggests that the fire's consumption of moisture retaining litter may also play a role in suppressing species post-fire. At the same time, most native perennial species are generally unharmed by the fire. But unfortunately, I've continued to collect data in this experiment beyond the 2 years post-fire shown in this slide. And what we're seeing there is that by the 3rd year after fire, annual brome cover was back up to its pre-fire level across the invasion gradient. And that's most probably happening because a single fire does not kill all brome seedlings and seeds. And each plant that does make it through the fire can produce hundreds of seeds and therefore reinvade. Some preliminary evidence suggests that a couple of fires in quick succession may lead to longer lasting control, but there's still a lot to learn about fire frequency effects on the species in this region. As with the cool season annual bromes, fire doesn't seem to promote the cool season perennials that have invaded tall grass and mixed grass prairies in the northern Great Plains. Prescribed fire has shown some promise for controlling some of these species, more so for Kentucky bluegrass than for smooth brome. But as with the annual bromes, it's more effective at lower levels of invasion. Also, prescribed fire seems more effective for controlling these species in areas where there's at least some separation of growing season between the invasive and the dominant native species. And this is the case where the cool season perennials invade the warm season dominated tall grass prairies. Although fire can reduce the abundance of these cool season perennials, it's often not sufficient by itself. And so as with the annual bromes, there's still a lot of work to do regarding whether frequent fires can reduce these species without sacrificing diversity of native species, and what other measures need to be combined with fire to achieve adequate control. In contrast to the cool season species, fire so far hasn't been shown to be a reliable means of controlling or at least reducing warm season invasive blue stems in the southern half of the Great Plains. Also, there's some evidence suggesting that these species benefit from frequent fires, at least in an area where annual prescribed fire is common management practice. So as with the cool season invasive grasses, controlling these species may require a combination of fire and other measures. Or as with the woody encroachers, fire in conditions outside the usual prescribed fire window may be needed. So in more severe conditions as in drought or mid-season. Another challenge with some of these invasive grasses is that, like the deciduous shrubs at Kanza, they can dampen fire behavior during prime prescribed fire seasons. So this photo shows how a prescribed fire at Badlands National Park in southwestern South Dakota a few weeks ago didn't carry into a dense patch of annual bromes. But there are also many opportunities for improving the use of fire for controlling these and other invasive grasses in the Great Plains. As I mentioned a few times already, there isn't much information about the effect of fire frequency for either preventing invasion by these species or restoring invaded grasslands. And there are always lots of contingencies. Figuring out why fire is successful for controlling invasive grasses in some situations, but not others, is tricky in experimental settings. Because of this, some managers in the eastern half of the northern Great Plains turned about a decade ago to adaptive management approaches. A couple of programs have reduced the uncertainties of what effect prescribed fire at different seasons or under different conditions will have on Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, and the native prairies that they've invaded. This learning has come through about a decade of implementation, but there's still more learning that can occur in these systems. And in addition, a new adaptive management program in National Park Service units in the western half of the northern Great Plains seeks to reduce uncertainties about fire effects on annual bromes as well as bluegrasses in northern mixed grass prairie. There's even less literature on the effect of fire on the wide range of invasive forbs in the Great Plains region, and I don't have time to delve much into what does exist. Instead, I'll just highlight the opposite ends of the spectrum. Manager experience suggests that fire may stimulate some species, such as the biennial common mullein and yellow sweet clover in this photo from the northern Great Plains. And the annual brome experiment I mentioned a few slides back supported this impression, but only at the site where these species were relatively abundant before the fire. At the other end of the spectrum, summer or fall fires are effective for controlling the perennial Sericea lespedeza, which has invaded the central plains of Kansas. And this occurs without substantial negative effects on the native species, at least in the year after the fire. However, in this area where raising cattle is a major use of the land, there's concerns about whether the fall fire's effects on cattle weight gain, and those need to be balanced with the benefits of controlling this invasive species. So that was a really brief look at how fire and invasive plants are related in the Great Plains. If you remember anything from this presentation, I'll hope that you'll take away these messages. First, fire generally does not promote invasive plants in the Great Plains. Second, fire is often useful for controlling invasive plants in the regions, at least in the short term. But more information is needed on whether thresholds exist when fire is useful and when it's not enough, the frequencies of fire needed to prevent invasion and to reduce invasion once it's happened, and of course, the big overarching problem of knowing or understanding how climate change will impact both the invasives and the opportunities that managers have to conduct their prescribed fires for controlling these species. I've gone too long, so I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Amy. And actually, we have an open slot for the next 20 minutes where John Keeley was going to speak. So we have 20 minutes that we can use for questions and answers for you and Doug if we want, or folks can take a break. But at 4 o'clock Eastern, we'll continue with Becky Kerns. And I don't see any questions for you right now, Amy. But if anyone has any, please feel free to ask. And there is a question that came for Doug, if Doug is still on and is available to answer. Doug, are you still on? Okay, great.
Still here.
So someone asked, and maybe Amy, you can answer this too, but if you're seeing any optimal time for prescribed burning to reduce invasives to enhance native ecosystems.
Yeah, so that's a challenging one. In a lot of the, and maybe if Matt Brooks is on, you could join in as well. But that's challenging because in a lot of the invasive and fire-prone areas of the Intermountain West and the more dry systems, especially where there are winter annuals, burning certainly can make the situation worse because effectively giving those winter annuals the environment that they need to prosper after fire. However, I think in the Southwest that may vary a bit, and I don't know if Matt's on this at the moment, if you want to jump in, but some of the perennial species in the Southwest that they different so that I'm not familiar with. And certainly I'm sure it varies as well on the Great Plains. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, this is Matt. I am on. I think for control of salt cedar for sure. I mentioned that in my presentation. Basically burning while they're actively growing. Similarly, I think for some of the desert grasslands, perennial grasslands, burning during their growing season is not good for the native species. And so, you know, the flip side of it, there has been some targets to try to burn during the early stages for annual grasses while they're still suspended in the seed bed. But it becomes challenging to get the right conditions to actually carry fire during that time. So that would be like a late winter, early spring type of burn timing. in Intermountain West areas. So, but that's also timing when say goat grazing on a small scale for fuel break, and seed consumption has been tried as well. So there are other alternatives to burning for biomass removal of non-native species, goats being one.
You know, I want to add, this is Carla D'Antonio. We've had the same problem trying to burn in the spring in Bromus dianders grasslands at UCSB, where we, in the late spring, when the seeds are still on the plant and you think, okay, we're going to really torch them away, the plants lodge, meaning they lie down. And then combined with morning dew, it becomes hard to get the right conditions to really burn them out, which is why we often use supplemental fuel, which is dried out like woody baccharis that we've cleared from some other place for another reason, to get that fire intensity. So you can do all the perfect planning on using seasonality, but it doesn't always work. Got to have tricks up your sleeve.
Yeah, I can add to that. It's some similar issues in the Great Plains, in that fall prescribed fires seem to work pretty well for this, at least short-term control of the annual bromes. But as you saw in that photograph, if you put that, or if that fire occurs too late in the season after the annual bromes have had a chance to get large enough that they are green and lush and don't carry the fire, then your fall fire won't do anything. And that's part of the reason that fire is put off to so late in the season, is because this was at a national park, and it's all the people that can conduct the prescribed fires are often out fighting wildfires in the West long into the prescribed fire season that's optimal for the Great Plains.
And if anyone else would like to join in the discussion, we're having a discussion now. One of our speakers had an open slot here, so we're going to continue our discussion. One person did ask in Huva, Amy, if there's somewhere they can get a summary to your talk or a paper to refer to. Do you have anything like that, Amy?
Not covering all of the material that I did in this yet, but as you will be mentioned many times in this session, there are plans to produce a summary or a publication covering all of the ground covered in all of these sessions, and I'm sure Matt can speak to that in much more detail.
Yeah, I could just add that the purpose of the fire circle in 2 days is to discuss that process of getting the information from these 3 parts of our session into a state of science summary. We have an outline that Mike Zupko is going to share as a last talk tomorrow of our session. And then will be sort of fodder for discussion during the fire circle. So if people are interested in providing input on the content of what that might be to be have maximum utility for people to use, as well as maybe people interested in contributing, that'll be the time to have that conversation during the fire circle.
Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask any of the presenters? I can add something to the chat saying that our schedule has been shifted a bit in case folks join late. In the meantime, we have about 10 minutes or so. So if you have questions, feel free to add them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll see you in 10 minutes.
If you're just joining us, we're just taking a quick break and we'll be rejoining with Becky Kerns' presentation at the top of the hour. And as a reminder, we'll be starting again at the top of the hour with a presentation by Becky Kerns, followed by Steve Norman. And we're going to get started in just about 3 minutes. Thanks for your patience.
All right, we're going to get started up again with Becky Kerns, and she's going to speak to us about plant invasion and fire in northwestern United States forests. And Becky, if you wouldn't mind loading up your screen.
Yep.
Awesome, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending my talk. I don't see my screen sharing yet.
We can see it now.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here this afternoon or morning or evening or whatever time it is, wherever you are. I wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge my awesome co-authors, Tina Tupsky, who is a postdoc with me at the Pacific Northwest Research Station in Corvallis through the ORISE program, Paula Fornwalt at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and Rebecca Lemons, also a postdoc with me at Oregon State University. So before I get started, I just want to emphasize that we are just starting this effort to work on this book chapter, creating a state of the science around this topic. And so this is really a little bit of a teaser as well as an invitation, a collaborative invitation. And so we are interested in building partnerships to tackle building this synthesis chapter. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm going to be talking about the northwestern forested mountains and the marine west coast forests. So this is this area here in orange and red that you see on the screen. We're going to be focusing on largely on forested environments, including like forest mosaics and woodlands. I would like to take a moment and acknowledge that these ecoregions are the ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples, and we acknowledge the complexity and the impact that colonialism has had on First Peoples. As you can imagine, an area so vast, it covers a diverse set of vegetation. So this area contains some of the highest mountains in North America, and so we have very steep environmental gradients across very fine spatial scales. So this leads to a lot of diverse complexity in our vegetation. We're talking basically about our interior western forests. It range from alpine to subalpine environments with species like Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, down into our lower elevation forests with ponderosa pine, interior Douglas fir, and species like western juniper. In our coastal forests, these are areas that have substantial maritime influence, and so they are very, tend to support very productive forests, wet climates, and even temperate rainforests. They are some of the most productive forests in North America. Common tree species include western hemlock, Douglas fir, and Sitka spruce, and along with some redwoods in the southern part of the region. Trees in this area can get extremely large and be very old. Historically, fire has played a really critical role in the maintenance of these stands in terms of forest structure, composition, and function, whether it's by maintaining open park-like stands in our drier forests through frequent low-severity fire, or by facilitating regeneration and landscape-scale successional complexity through very infrequent high-severity fire. There are many fire management challenges in these systems, and I'm just going to touch upon a few. We can have highly destructive wildfires in these systems. An example of this is the 2018 Camp Fire in Northern California. It was not only the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California, but it was the most expensive natural disaster in the world in 2018. Almost 19,000 structures were destroyed, and there were 85 confirmed deaths. The 2020 Oregon fires destroyed over 3,000 buildings and killed 10 people, with numerous large fires in our marine coast forests. Another example is the 2020 Cameron Peak Fire in Colorado that destroyed over 400 structures. And there's a lawnmower behind me, and I'm very sorry about that. Hopefully you can still hear me. I could go on and on. The main point here is that we do have very destructive forest fires in these systems. Another major fire management challenge is that these forests are really the subject of a lot of fuel management. fire exclusion, fuel accumulation, climate change, and other types of disturbances over many, many decades are now interacting with fire. And this has really ushered in a new era of fire management focused on fuel reduction and restoring fire to these forests. Dry forests are the focus of much thinning and burning to increase forest resilience. We also have a lot of treatments in drier mixed conifer forests and our coastal mixed severity forests as well. So this is a challenge in implementing treatments without creating new weed habitats or exacerbating populations. So now let's turn to invasive plants and talk a little bit about some of these species that are lurking in time and space in our forested systems. So invasive plants in forests come in all types, shapes, and forms. We have shade tolerant species that are lurking in our forest understories. We have opportunistic early seral species that can be highly invasive after disturbance. We also have invasive species that are lurking right in the open in more stable open landscape features within forests, what we like to call the non-forest in the forest. So these are things like dry and wet meadows. These areas can also harbor particularly shade intolerant invasive species. There's a lot of ecotonal areas next to forests that have been highly impacted by invasive species. And as conditions change, whether it's through disturbance or shifts in climate, these ecotonal areas can also harbor species and be invasive into forests. A lot of these forested systems support extensive rural, semi-rural, and wildland-urban interface communities. These types of places can harbor invasive species that might not be fully naturalized in forests, but can create high fuel loads around these communities and create a lot of issues around their management. So some of these invasions can alter tactical and strategic fire and fuel management operations, connect landscapes, and alter fire regimes. So this is a list from a 2008 publication edited by Zohar called Fire and Non-Native Invasive Plants. And it's kind of the building block around which we are hoping to build on, and kind of use it as a springboard. So we're going to be looking into how this list has changed, what species should still be on this list, what should we add to, what are the drivers of these changes, how did the estimated invasion threats for these different species really play out in the past 13 years. And so I'm going to touch on just a few examples to kind of get us going here. The first species I'm going to talk about is something, if you've been attending any of these other sessions, you've heard a lot about, and that's cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is an annual grass. It's both an old concern, and it remains a concern now, and is even a concern in new environments. So cheatgrass is known for increasing post-fire and has been linked to the creation of grass fire cycles. This has mostly been a lot of literature and information around fire in more arid systems, but cheatgrass can be problematic, particularly in low elevation forested systems. We used to think that cheatgrass might be somewhat ephemeral in these systems, but cover really can persist and increase after fire in our drier forests. The graph here on the left is some data of mine from a ponderosa pine forest in Eastern Oregon that has been burned using prescribed fire with different fall and spring fire regimes at 5 and 15 years. And you can see that certain fire regimes have really led to an increase in cheatgrass. So we also have new concerns about cheatgrass in some higher elevation forests, particularly lodgepole pine and some drier mixed conifer forests. Another species I'm going to talk about that I think has been mentioned, I think Doug might have mentioned, Bentonata dubia. This is a newer annual grass. It was introduced near Spokane, Washington, and has spread very rapidly. It's now found in 8 Western states and parts of Canada with a very rapid spread rate. So Vetonata has been linked to fire spread and has the potential to fuel a grass fire cycle. Recent research has really demonstrated that this species, though, has a very novel niche. It's not just another cheatgrass. And so a lot of the resilience concepts that we've built up around cheatgrass don't necessarily apply for Vetonata. And there's some new work that we've been recently publishing around this, around the resilience of Vetonata. Looking at what could happen in the Western US, there's a lot of potential climate habitat throughout the Northwestern forest for Vetonata. This is some preliminary model output that we've been working on from a boosted regression tree model. This data suggests that just looking at climate niche alone, we could have some potential invasions in the Eastern Cascades, parts of the Sierras, the Northern Rockies, the Wasatch, and into the Juanita Mountains. We also know from our field and wildfire simulation studies that Vetonata can alter fire regimes, and it is in some systems, it is really introducing fire as a new process in some non-forested habitats within our forest mosaics. And so if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Vetonata, we have several talks about this at some 2 sessions on Wednesday and Thursday called Getting into the Weeds, and I encourage you to attend those. And we have some publications that have come out and are also should be out in the next 6 months or so. So I'm going to switch over to the coastal forests and talk about a species that's been around and problematic for quite a long time, and that's gorse. Gorse is a fire-loving shrub that's very common in our coastal cities and forests. It's this yellow patches you can see out here in this landscape. And gorse fueled a fire that burned an entire city in southwestern Oregon, the city abandoned in 1936. And it's been really important in several subsequent fires as recently as 2015. These coastal forests are really challenging because they have super high productivity and regrowth, a lot of human population and ignition sources. So it makes both management of invasive species as well as fire management quite challenging. So the last species I'm going to talk about is false brome. False brome was listed, as was gorse, I might not have mentioned that, in that list from the 2008 chapter that I showed a few slides ago. False brome is a perennial bunch grass that grows in the understories of a lot of Douglas fir forests in Western Oregon. At the time that Zohar chapter came out, we didn't know much about false brome, but we have quite a bit of, well, not quite a bit, but we have several new research studies around false brome. So initial speculation was that this species would increase fire susceptibility because of the really homogeneous and a different fuel type it is in this system. We don't have a lot of perennial grasses in these types of forests. However, data from the native range actually showed a negative association with burned areas, and some recent research is kind of insightful for false brome. So this is a paper from 2015 where they found that false brome increased seedling emergence increases in low and moderate severity fires, but false brome did not necessarily increase fire severity. So what they found was that high severity prescribed fire areas really didn't support populations of false brome, but these lower severity areas did. And this was supported by greenhouse seedling emergence data. So this is interesting in that we might not worry as much about false brome in a higher severity wildfire situation, but if we're going to be introducing lower severity fire into some of these forests, then we might have an issue with managing false brome in these systems. Lastly, I just want to point out that the issues around fire and invasive species management, of course, impact or interact with other stressors such as climate change. The one goal of our work is going to be to bring in this complexity around these interrelationships. So we know that forested ecosystems are constantly being exposed to new species, as well as old species that might be lurking in space and time and creating new problems. Climate change can increase plant invasion by stressing our native plants, altering ecosystem dynamics such as competition, changing wildfire regimes, and providing new invasion opportunities. While we try to mitigate the effects of more wildfires and larger wildfires on the landscape through our forest restoration and overstory management, we could be creating new invasion opportunities and creating new problems and changes in fuel structures. So a deeper and more nuanced understanding about the potential impacts of invasive plants as a wildland fuel and interactions with other disturbances is really critical and important to building resilient forest landscapes. So last, I would like to just kind of reiterate that collaborative invitation and encourage any discussion for folks who might want to have some questions, but we have just started our effort and we are interested in building some partnerships. This is a large area with a lot of environmental variability, and it would be great to have additional cooperators with us on this effort. And then again, I'm going to point to the 2 sessions we have tomorrow and Thursday, getting into the weeds, where you can kind of learn more about some of the species that I talked about today. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. That was great. I don't see any questions in the chat, although I'm dying to ask you about questions you'll probably answer in the Into the Weeds, but you gave a teaser of how Ventonata is not just another cheatgrass. Mm-hmm. Can you give a teaser of what you're finding that's different?
Yeah, so I had a citation for a paper that a PhD student, Claire Tortorelli, and she is talking, although I think she's actually talking on a little bit of a different subject, but it might come in. And basically, she looked at the niche around both Medusa head, cheatgrass, and Ventonata. And what we're finding is that Ventonata really thrives in our frigid basalt-derived higher elevation soils in the Northwest. And these places have really not experienced any annual grass invasion at all. And they've been exposed to cheatgrass and Medusa head propagules for a very, very long time, and they've always been resistant to invasion. And so that's just quite a bit of a game changer in terms of thinking about which systems are resilient. And so we really need to, when we have a new invasive annual grass, it's important to not necessarily put them all in the same box, especially as we think about resilience concepts.
Thanks.
And I can, if anyone wants, I can put links to papers that I talked about in the chat.
Yeah, I think that would be awesome. Thank you.
Thanks. So I probably need to stop sharing, right?
Sure, yep.
I need to find my window here.
So in about 1 minute, we will move on to Steve Norman. So Steve, if you want to start getting ready to share your screen.
Okay, can you hear me? When I
We can
hover
hear
over
you.
my computer icon to show my video, I get a little pop-up for some reason. There we go, start my video. There we go.
Yep, we can see you and hear you.
We can see you.
And now,
thanks so much, Steve.
I will share my screen. All right. Can we see that?
Yes, looks great. Thank you.
All right. So is it time?
Perfect. Yes.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to present today. This talk is going to provide an overview of fire invasives across the entire eastern US and address some broad biogeographical challenges and opportunities here. There will be some overlap with Rima's talk from earlier in the afternoon, but I've tried to keep this very general and broad and focused on some fundamental differences between the issues here versus the West. So first, I'd like to recognize my co-authors, JT Vogt Curriers and Jeff Eichwart. And this map shows these three regions that we're going to talk about to some degree. The northern forests include the upper Midwest, northern Pennsylvania, Adirondacks, and New England in blue. This is a forest type dominated by pines, hemlock, northern hardwoods. And the green dots on this map are the large fires of MTBS in the last couple decades. And note that most of these large fires within the blue type, within this northern forest type, are in northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. It's not to say that there's not smaller fires elsewhere, there are, but the larger fires are concentrated in only a part of this region. And then jumping down to the tip of Florida, we have tropical wet forests that have seen a lot of large fire, but much of that's prescribed. And then covering this vast, very diverse middle zone is the eastern temperate forest, and that's oak, pine, mesophytic types. And there's quite a bit of large fire here in some areas, in the coastal plain, in the Piedmont especially, the southern Appalachians, the central Appalachians, and Ozarks in particular, have seen a lot of fires that have been mapped. And let's not, of course, forget southern New Jersey and the Pine Barrens there. Much of this, not all of it, much of it has been prescribed. So what is special about Eastern fire? There's a lot of prescribed fire, and it's relatively low severity by design. These are usually very selected sites. Most spring and fall wildfires are of human origin, although lightning fires do happen, especially in Florida. Summer drought fires are of special concern throughout much of this region because they burn with higher severity, and that can have a big outcome on the invasive species that result. Compared to the West, wildfires tend to be smaller, and response can be very, very efficient due to the dense road network and urban interface. There's a lot of local fire departments and a lot of institutional response speed to get to some of these fires. And that matters, of course, for invasive hazards as well. So it's not necessarily that much of a good thing. Wildfire severity tends to vary greatly over short distances due to topography, fuels, and weather. So what's special about Eastern non-native invasive plants and fire? So first, this has a massive, massive non-native invasive species pool from over a century of accidental, deliberate introductions. Many of these interact in some way with fire, and their prevalence means that multiple invasives can be of concern in a given local area. And what's interesting is there's often a rich native species diversity here too across the eastern landscape, eastern landscape, and that can infect diversity. That native biodiversity can have an effect on the invasibility of those sites. So lots of invasives. Second, the ubiquity of disturbance from many causes is truly a hallmark of this and a better part of this region. It provides both chronic opportunities for spread and recurrent opportunities for invasive spread. Fire is often not the dominant disturbance that explains invasive patterns. Lots of disturbance. Third, fragmented management, fragmented ownership, and that constrains our ability to manage invasives effectively to landscape scale. And so much of this landscape has been parcellated. It means that invasives are likely in some of these areas to remain unmanaged, somewhere within a neighborhood that can recontaminate that broader landscape with tremendous challenges for how we deal with these invasives. And then at the bottom here, I added this recently. This is a very simple East-specific conceptual model, and it shows these two-directional feedbacks that are common in, I think, in a lot of the talks that we've seen. It's probably a world phenomenon. But what's special about these isn't just that invasives can affect fire, and then fire can affect the pattern of invasives. And there's different subsets of invasive species that we're talking about with that at the bottom. But it can constrain the nature of management. Some invasives, when they're present, you might change the timing of your fire, which can then in turn affect subsequent invasive problems. And this is all constrained in the East by this looming problem of development as a chronic hazard, as well as a fragmented managerial constraint. So how big is the problem for invasives in the East? We're fortunate to have this analysis of our broad random national FIA sample. And we know that non-native invasive plants are incredibly pervasive across the Eastern forest types. And this is just some of the forest types within the zone. These are the ones that I think are relatively more commonly talked about when we're talking about fire restoration or where we have wildfire. This is the percent of FIA plots within these types that shows some invasive. And of course, many of these invasives are not going to have big consequences for subsequent fire effects. They might be invasives that really just don't interact with fire, and they might not even be there again because of fire. A lot of these are just waiting to have a significant disturbance. And what's surprising is just how extensive this invadedness is across this region based on this paper. So being slow to materialize is a common attribute of these non-native invasive grasses in the East. Here's 5 important ones: common reed, Japanese stilt grass, Burma reed, Chinese silvergrass, which I've been studying quite a bit lately, and Kogan grass. These are simple county occurrence maps. It says nothing about the density of these invasives there or the likely impacts on fire regimes. Severe fire often favors grass. These grasses can increase flammability and fire intensity. Competition and shade can reduce them over time in the years after they might come in. But once the canopy is chronically opened by especially fire restoration, where that's part of the goal, and it is on a lot of these sites where we prescribe burn, invasive grasses can increase fire ignition intensity, rate of spread, and through feedbacks gradually expand cover at the expense of native species and even the management objectives that we might have for a site. So this sequence of photos here shows how a fire regime with Kogan grass functions. Pine forests with Kogan grass burn hot. This increases pine mortality. Rapid resprouting of the grass after fire makes it harder for pine and native understory species to regenerate and flourish. And these infestations can be made worse by wildfire or prescribed fire. It's a great complicator. Now, we don't have time to talk about non-native invasive shrubs, although there are many that relate to fire. Here's 5 trees that some of which have been already talked about a little bit. They interact with fire in different ways. Some have litter fuel that reduces fire spread, and the crown closure can reduce the wind on the surface and make it harder to breathe, harder for fire to spread. Other species can increase fire with their litter. Many of these resprout vigorously after fire, and they're hard to eradicate. And that can have big implications for restoration goals, and it can strain the pathways that are really available to accomplish those goals. Tree heaven, calorie pear, melaleuca, tallow tree, princess tree, the list is long. And what's interesting to me as I look at these maps, and again, they're not density, they're just basic range maps, but there's a very good chance that in any given place across the East, you're going to have one of these trees, just like one of these grasses that we looked at earlier, or one of the shrubs, which I haven't shown, that could be a problem for you. A high number of invasives, lots of invasives, makes the problem very, very difficult. Now, to briefly touch on one tree that's dear to my heart, Paulownia, princess tree, well adapted to tough sites like the brick walls and gutters around Asheville. This picture in the upper left is downtown. You can see this. Tourists come to take pictures of non-invasive, non-native invasive plants that grow on rock walls around Asheville, I guess, like me. And that's important because if you look at the picture in the bottom, you can see where it's a problem in Linville Gorge Wilderness on similar types of habitat, rocky cliffs. We have a long-standing infestation in areas that have burned repeatedly. In this case, in Linville, 3 times since 2000, the site's burned, and it's now has a chronic infestation of Bologna that can affect the viability of native T&E species like Hudsonia montana, shown at left. Big growth after the 2016 Southern App Fire season as well. So we have lots of invasives. So the second special attribute of eastern forest is that we have a lot of disturbance. And this map shows the frequency of canopy disturbance that I generated for a report paper at 10 meters resolution using Google Earth Engine. For 1 year, 2019 to 2020, much of the West was in drought. That's why it's the color it is. Drought is a disturbance that may not necessarily matter for invasives, but in the East, these patterns can have rather great significance. In the Piedmont and coastal plain, in the Southeast, we have a lot of timber harvesting that can facilitate invasive spread. There are opportunities for invasive spread. We also see the additive effects of Hurricane Michael in Florida's Panhandle from that year. Conversion to developed insectifoliations, tornadoes and derechos make up the rest. Some of those are more likely to cause invasive spread than others. And in addition to those events, we have large areas that have chronic disturbance due to their land use and road system. And we can use the National Land Cover Database to just generalize it down to 3 types: developed, agricultural, and natural. Kurt Ritters has done this for years. And we can map the fractional neighborhood composition of these general types at different spatial resolution. So this is another way to view the wildland-urban interface, or the agricultural wildland interface on the left. That said, it's important to remember that the current natural condition of so much of our forest, a lot of that used to be non-forest a century ago. It wasn't just logged, it was settled, it was fields, it was pastures, and these areas have since grown up across New England, across the Piedmont, across the Cotton Belt, across the mountains. And that legacy is a known problem for bringing invasives in. It's a little different from those areas that have never gone through that land use historical legacy. So if we can map these, right? Because it comes from spatial data. The blue area, this is what southern apps here near me. Asheville's in the upper right, Knoxville's in the upper left. And we have a lot of blue. We have a lot of natural areas today. So how vulnerable is this landscape to non-native invasive plant and fire interactions? So we could use expert opinion or some local plot data if we had that. And to some degree we do with the FIA data set. We can put values on these different elements. Downtown areas, yes, Bologna grows on buildings, but that's not where the forest is. And so the 5 here represents this interface area, this edge habitat that a lot of research suggests is most vulnerable compared to those more distant, more remote natural areas. This is somewhat hypothetical. We can then map these values. And if we do that, this is what we get. The green are large fires from MTBS. And the most important thing to look at is the fact these green areas are, for the most part, inside the white, inside that relatively low risk part of the landscape. There's some exceptions. If you look down here, you can see my cursor in west of the Great Smokies. That's the Chimney Tops 2 fire, and that burned a lot of homes in 2016. A lot of invasive risks within the edge there, and in a few other of these fires. But for the most part, the large fire risk is confined to these natural areas. And so we might ask, so is this what we're actually seeing on the ground, right? Do we have any natural to natural area transmission? At what point are we going to start to see that, especially as these landscapes burn more and more and invasives can come in? And it's really been brought home to me lately because of my work in Linville Gorge, very close to home, one of the first wilderness areas in the entire East to be established. And it's burned a lot. It's a vertical wilderness with lots of cliffs and snakes, and it burns regularly. It's hard to get these invasive species like this, Miscanthus chinensis, Chinese silvergrass, out of the system, just like Paulownia. And this has persisted now through at least 2 fires and incredibly aggressive efforts to try to remove it. And so in my mind, this place seems to have transitioned from a land cover associated fire invasive hazard, where distance and remoteness are really what drives patterns, as it's reburning and being restored naturally by wildfire, to a more local within natural area severity hazard, as fire becomes chronic, much like a road, much like a regularly disturbed habitat. And third thing about, I'm just going to touch on this briefly, fragmented management, parcelization. This particular fire, the high severity shown in red, and the parcellated lines all through there, the different owners. You can see some of these areas are homes that or properties that were not yet developed. But the important point here is that all these high severity areas are where you can have invasives, and it's really hard to get rid of them when you have fragmented management. When it reburns, the seeds can come in from very close away. And this is a phenomenon across the East. The lack of large parcels makes it incredibly difficult to manage invasives. So not to end there, I want to talk about some great opportunities, some special opportunities that we have in the East because we prescribe burns so much. Invader abundance increases on the y-axis, and this is an old graph from Hobbs and Humphreys from a long time ago. There's different stages that you can think of strategically to manage invasives, from quarantine to eradication to control, as invasives become more common, and that's shown in the gray line. But in this system, we seem to have pulses of invasion that come from disturbance. And if it's a big hot disturbance, quite often we have a lot more bare mineral soil and canopy loss, a lot more invasive spread. And the invasive invader abundance can increase greatly. And so the question, because we can't get rid of these so often, it's how do we assimilate? And so the obvious question to ask is, can, with certain prescribed fire frequencies or regimes, can we properly assimilate to make sure these invasives are assimilated, but yet play well with others, with the native species? Hopefully that's something that we can do. We can think of these two together. We have this natural, developed to natural land cover hazard on the x-axis here, and then disturbance severity, which we can regulate. And sometimes even a single event in a regime can force something to change. They move to a new stable state. The biggest concern of these areas near developments that can be disturbed hot, but increasingly we need to worry about some of these more remote areas. So we have lots of invasives. Integrated management can reduce these cumulative effects from having so many of them. We need to monitor. There's so much disturbed habitat. We need to monitor before and after all disturbances, not just after fire, because the story here is not just about fire. Due to fragmented management, we have to talk about collaboration and outreach. It's especially important here. And the East's particular susceptibility to invasives means that prescribed fire may be particularly helpful to reduce the chance of severe fire that can lead to these extreme invasive spread events. And over time, though, these reburns could become a problem, maybe akin to chronically disturbed land cover types. And hence there's a need for continuous monitoring and adaptive management. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. I don't see any questions in the chat. We have about 1 minute, so if you have a question, start typing. Steve, your presentation covered an enormous area. Do you think that there's particular ecosystems that are more at risk for further invasion due to fire than others? I know at one point you had a table with many ecosystems, and I wonder if that answers that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's an intersection of where there's the propagule pressure and where there's fire. So in much of the Northeast, there's not a lot of fire. In fact, even with climate change scenarios, there's reason to think they might get wetter and there's not much excitement for a prescribed fire either. And it's just got a lot of resistance. And so although the invasive pressure can increase, a lot of that's not going to necessarily facilitate more wildfire spread at any scale. It can do it locally, of course, within prized wildlife areas. The big elephant in the room, of course, is Florida. The answer is always, in the East, it's always going to be Florida, 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 Florida. Florida's invasive problem is profound. I didn't get any time to talk about it, but it's hard to describe how bad the problem can be there because they burn so much and the wildfire risk is so great and the invasive pressures are so profound as well and redundant. So I'd have to just say Florida, 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 Southern Florida.
Thanks so much. And now I'm going to turn it back over to our producer with a couple of announcements. Thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you, Ilana, and thank you, Steve. Thank you for all of our speakers today for sharing your expertise with us. This session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Up next, we have a 20-minute break before our last set of breakouts begin. We have 2 special session breakouts, a general session, and a safe meeting and trivia networking session, all beginning at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the Agenda tab to the left of your screen and click Sessions. You can also click Subsessions for more details about what to expect. To join the session offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, be sure to select the session titled Actions for Sustaining Biodiversity in Fire-Prone Ecosystems. Thanks again to our speakers and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.